Hello. Hope everybody's having a great day. It's great to be inside, right? Is it still raining out? I assume so. Thank you all for coming. It's great to be here. Really wonderful to be part of the Chicago Humanities Festival. And it's just a treat for me. And so I'm going to present for a little bit about augmented and virtual reality that we're doing at the Chicago History Museum. And then we'll have some time at the end to take questions, and we can get into it a little bit. Why am I here? I'm here because I think that this is some really interesting and provocative stuff that's happening at the Chicago History Museum, but it's also happening around the country in museums specifically. Augmented and virtual reality is transforming the way we're thinking about collections, the way we're talking about history, the way we're talking about content in general, the way we're engaging the public, and the way we're internally thinking about the value and the meaning of our collections, and really breaking through into some new territory in terms of how to use them and how other people could engage with them, and maybe breaking down some of those barriers to engagement that really have always been there for museums and collecting organizations in terms of how do you draw people into a relationship with collections that are hard to see, maybe sometimes hard to access, and maybe even harder to understand without somebody there to sort of take your hand and give you some insights and share some of the knowledge of them that isn't completely and immediately visible when you look at them. So one of the first questions a lot of people ask is when you're talking about modified reality, how does that connect with history? What's the relationship there, right? They seem sort of incongruous. And our understanding is pretty simple, but I understand that frequently people don't necessarily know what augmented and virtual reality are. So just a quick way for us to talk about it so that you understand how we're working with it at the History Museum. If you look at this image here, you see a color image of essentially contemporary, present-day North Clark Street. So St. Valentine's Day Massacre happened on North Clark Street, just a little bit north of the museum. A little bit north of North Avenue. And that color image was taken in relatively recent months, and so it's a current depiction. The black and white imagery there is from 1929. These are images from the museum's collection that have been inserted into that image. So if you think about a situation in which you are experiencing augmented reality, it's an opportunity for you to have media, say on a mobile device like your phone, be in a place like North Clark Street, to have an app loaded on your phone or on your tablet that would allow you to see images of things that aren't there but were there in the past. You are completely aware of your circumstances, right? You're on North Clark Street. You can feel the wind. You can see buses and people walking by, but you can also point your phone across the street and see these historical images. And virtual reality, instead of retaining that quality of place that you are in the present, we try to sort of overwhelm your visual senses so that you are essentially transported to a different time and a different place. Even though you might be seeing simultaneously the present and the past, your physical location doesn't really matter in the equation anymore. And so that would be a circumstance in which you would use something like one of these headset viewers. You would put your device inside it, and you would have this sort of experience. You'd no doubt have seen people with these kinds of things on, right? They look a little silly. I probably look a little silly right now, right? Looking around like this, and they're deeply immersed in this content. You have no idea what it is, and they look like they could walk off the stage or something. But virtual reality is an attempt to create a whole new circumstance for you to experience the content. So, graphic. So I wonder for all of you, when you thought of this word, when you heard the theme for this year's Humanities Festival, what you thought of, and I don't mean that literally to take a poll of the audience, but I'm just curious to, as you think about it, to keep that in mind. What were the immediate words or images that came to your mind when you saw this? Well, I want to share what came to my mind when the Humanities Festival approached me about being part of this. this image came to my mind. Does anybody recognize this? Show of hands, anybody? Nobody. This is George C. Scott in a movie called Hardcore that came out in 1979. And I was 15 years old. I could not see this movie. I believe it was rated R. It's a Paul Schrader film. And he was both writer and director for it. I still have never seen it. But this is the image that came to my mind when the word graphic was used as this year's theme. And I think that speaks to the power of images, right? I mean, like I said, I've never seen this film. I actually don't know the story of this film. But I do know that the idea was that this man's daughter is somehow roped into the pornography industry. And at this moment, he's in anguish. He's watching her on the screen in this film, and he's convinced that she's been kidnapped and she's being tormented. And of course, he's being tormented. And I can relate to him, even though I don't know him. I didn't have children at the time. I was 15. And I've always thought that was really a remarkable reminder, to me anyway, the power of images and the power of empathy in the way we look at how other people experience their time and their life, and how do we sort of help us in the present imagine what that was like in the past. So this is how people encountered the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. I did this morning. This is just a screenshot of images of the search was something like newspapers of St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And you'll see here how people encounter lots of images of the Chicago Daily News, the massacre of 7 from the Moran gang. Some people had already equated it with gangland killing. Some people didn't know that the men in the garage who were murdered were gangsters. And just to remind, I mean, this is like one of those stories. It's like talking about the Declaration of Independence. You sort of feel like you don't need to explain it in Chicago, but quickly, 1929, 7 men gunned down in a garage on North Clark Street as part of what is going on in Chicago at the time is a prohibition rivalry over liquor distribution and control of gangland territory. There's one here actually says that their police might be involved, and of course there were some of the people who perpetrated the crime were dressed as policemen. And you can understand how the moment that these stories were told is still, to a large degree, the stories that we think of now, right? This is sort of the way we still see this event. So I was surprised by that, but I was also reminded that we've heard so many horrible stories about senseless murder, right? I mean, just last weekend, another one. And yet, in 1929, images from inside the garage, if you look at that fourth one over on the top row, I mean, that's a shot on the front page of a newspaper of 7 men dead on the floor of the garage. So we were really confronted in 1929 with some pretty graphic violence on the front page of newspapers around the country. And it's a powerful reminder, I think, of the way we present these sorts of catastrophes today, these sort of massacres today. We don't see them, literally see them in the same way that we did in the past. So this brings us to Chicago 00, which is this platform we've created at the History Museum to try and engage with digital media in order to bring that content into people's lives in a more meaningful and substantive way. It's no surprise to everybody in this room that we are all increasingly spending more and more time on our laptops, on our phones, tablets. We're talking and communicating and sharing, and to some degree our lives are happening in a digital world. And of course the History Museum doesn't want to say that history isn't part of that. I think we are part of that, and I think that we can be engaged in that as an entity that can remind us of our humanity and reconnect us to the city in really meaningful ways. And what you're looking at here is sort of an array of some of the projects that I'll be talking about today. We'll get back to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in just a minute. But I did want to say that part of what we were thinking was that digital media in app form, in augmented and virtual reality, could be a kind of new direction for documentary film. And what I mean by that is if you imagine this film. As you might have heard in the bio at the beginning, I was asked to be part of the consultation group to work on this film with Ken Burns and Lynn Novick. Without a doubt, if they're not some of the best documentary filmmakers in the country, they're certainly some of the most successful documentary filmmakers in the country. And it was really interesting watching this process of script writing, development, and filming both the contemporary scenes and using historical footage. And what I was struck by was that the story was told in this very episodic format. And it struck me that most documentary films are told that way. If you imagined a documentary film of the history of Chicago, it would probably have an episode on who was here before the fur trappers came, and maybe it's got an episode on the development of the skyscraper, and maybe it's got an episode on the stockyards or the Great Chicago Fire. And when you got done watching the film, they would all be knit together, and you'd watch it from the beginning to the end, and when it was done, you'd feel like you had a sense of this place, like what were the critical moments in its history, who were the players, who were the movers and shakers, who made Chicago what it is today. And but it would still be linear. It would still be, somebody would have directed it, somebody would have put it in motion and started at the beginning and ended at the end, and we would have all been sort of passively looking at that. And we started thinking that maybe the future of documentary film is these sorts of episodic apps, projects that would do the same thing. It would tell the story of Chicago in episodes, but it would be interactive, it would be immersive, it would be mobile, it would happen on your schedule. You could do them in the order that we think you should do them, or you could do them in the order that you want to do them in. If you think that, say, Valentine's Day Massacre is too violent and sort of gruesome, you don't want to watch that one, you don't have to. So we have gotten very caught up with this idea that we could be creating a new way of understanding Chicago and actually having it more dynamic, more immersive, and really living more in what I see as a new digital age for storytelling. So back to the graphic theme. When we first started out with this project, we were struggling with some of the challenges of creating and managing the new imagery, right? So you see here an overlay, a superimposition, if you will. So all around the exterior, wherever you're seeing color, you're seeing essentially what is our present. The black and white image is the past. You notice you can really see where it is, right? You can see this hard edge here at the bottom. And we struggled a little bit with how to make it obvious that, especially as we knew we would get into more present time, we wouldn't have black and white color distinctions. You know, how are we going to call out what was versus what is? How are we going to let people see the past in the present? So some experiments we did were like with this perforation on the one side. This is really just a still shot so that we could experiment with the model and think a little bit about how it might be done. One of the things we found with that process was that people were really underwhelmed after a while with just the superimposition, just seeing the past overlay against the present. You know, first 5 or 6 shots, people are like, oh my God, this is incredible, I can't believe it. You take them, you get to image 20 and they're like, yeah, okay, get it. And so we realized there was a story that was missing. They wanted to hear me tell them why these, you know, what is this woman doing? Is she at a drinking fountain? You know, what kind of car was that? Who's this guy? You know, suddenly the content mattered. And it was a great reminder to us that it's all about story, even if it's told in a visual medium. So we started our first episode, building around the idea that we were going to build a collection of episodes that would then explore Chicago history in this way. So this is augmented reality. Remember, augmented reality is a device. You're aware of your surroundings. So in this image, all these people in the foreground are looking at the SS Eastland. Now, if you don't know the story of the SS Eastland, it's a ship that was on an excursion leaving from this location on the Chicago River in 1915, summer. It was an outing for Western Electric employees. The employees were on the boat tipped over, and killed 844 people in about 3 minutes. Worst loss of life in Chicago history happened right here, across from the Reed Murdoch building, which was there at the time. And all of these people are registering their phones against that building, and then because the camera on their phone can see the building, they then can see the Eastland. And all of the media that we have that tells the story of the Eastland is then available to you through your device. So, augmented reality, all these people are very aware of where they are. They're hearing, looking, reading about the story of the Eastland, essentially being in the one place, but at two separate times, because they're aware of their surroundings, but they're seeing this visual media that's animating this space as if it were 1915. So in that, just to sort of further explain that, I'm holding a device looking down the bank. This woman here on the left, she's looking out into the river at the images of the Eastland. Because I'm in a different location and looking down the bank, I'm seeing the shoreline shots of the divers going in for the recovery, and I'm seeing her at the same time. Another image that's up on the street, these are the crowds that gathered at the time to see what had happened. This woman took the very first tour I gave of the Eastland disaster. She thinks of herself as a survivor because her grandmother, her pregnant grandmother, was on the boat, got off the boat, and if she hadn't gotten off the boat, she wouldn't be here, so she wanted me to make this composite. I really think this is a horrible image, but she really loved the idea that she was in it, the ship was in it, and the memorial plaque that's at the corner of LaSalle and Wacker were all there. But once again, it really demonstrated to me that there was real power here for people who wanted to bring that history to the places where it actually happened. So this is when we started thinking about virtual reality more. So this is just a shot of these viewers. And the big advantage here, of course, with virtual reality is it's the same experience no matter where you are. You don't have to, in the Eastland disaster with augmented reality, you have to be at the site of the disaster. Here, you can do this experience anywhere, and it's the same. So there are 3 episodes that we have in Chicago 00 at this point. One is on the Century of Progress World's Fair. This is a second World's Fair in Chicago. It happened around Northerly Island and where the Field Museum and the Soldier Field are. You can see Soldier Field is sort of represented here in the past. You can see a series of dirigible there flying above. So there's a mixture of then and now shots in this. One of the things that really we realized with virtual reality was that we were able to not only take you to the past, but take you to a place you can't be today, which is up 400 feet off the ground at the Sky Ride. So the Sky Ride was like the Ferris wheel of 1893. The Ferris wheel was sort of the big attraction there. The Sky Ride was the big attraction in the World's Fair of 1933. And many of the images we have in the collection were taken from the Sky Ride. And so we were trying to figure out how to get people up there. And of course, with augmented reality, you would have to somehow be up there to look down and see those images. But with virtual reality, we were able to create an experience in which you felt like you were up at that height. We just released a Democratic National Convention augmented virtual reality experience. Maybe one of the most important moments in Chicago history, and often for many it's still a living memory. This is an opportunity. Once again, we started to experiment a little bit here with what color on color might look like. And so this is, I don't know how many of you know exactly where you are vis-a-vis the Democratic National Convention, but we are just blocks away from where it happened. And if you had the app with you, you could stand essentially here and see both the Logan statue as it is today, probably with nobody out there because it's raining, and simultaneously see it crowded with protesters as it was in 1968. So that brings us to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. So once again, here's this image that shows the superimpositions, and it gives us a chance to explore this time in Chicago. So I want to do a little a little step back again for a moment before I show you the experience, because I think one of the things that's really interesting to me as an employee and as a former curator at the Chicago History Museum is how uncomfortable we are as a city talking about Capone and the gangs, which I know maybe for many of you seems sort of weird. You probably don't think that you're uncomfortable talking about it, but the city's uncomfortable talking about it. The city's uncomfortable acknowledging it. There really aren't any historical plaques to people who were part of this. People come to the History Museum all the time and they say, well, where was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre? And believe it or not, there's no way to find it. I mean, the building that it happened in was just up the street from the museum. But we frequently have to give people directions on how to get there and tell them that when you get there, it's kind of hard to know that you're there because it's just an empty lot. But there are very few landmarks, and we've often gotten pushback from the city and past administrations about promoting this. But the graphic nature, back to the graphics of all of this, I think that there's really incredible documentation of this time period in Chicago history that sort of simultaneously gets pushed aside because we have this ongoing discomfort talking about the gangs and what they meant and how they shaped the city. So for example, this is a map of Chicago it's a stylized map, obviously, but it's showing Chicago jazz spots. You see that up in the upper left-hand corner. And the idea was that somebody was trying to identify all of the nightlife venues where Chicago jazz really took root in the late teens and 20s. And so they were just identifying all these venues around the city, and it's a little difficult to navigate, but it's an interesting document of the time. And in this document, I think you can see some of the most critical things that shaped Chicago in the 20th century. For one, you see the gangsters and you see the Prohibition era, and you really understand vice and crime. This is rife with vice. These are brothels, these are nightclubs, these are the illegal drinking establishments of the 20s. But what also is here is the history of the beginnings of living a true emancipated life for a lot of American women, especially young women, who were basically excluded from nightlife venues for lots of social reasons and family reasons and sort of decorum. But nevertheless, because of the secretive nature, the underground nature of all of this nightlife, there were women who were being introduced to life as an adult woman who might be single and independent, but could be in these venues in part because these venues were all built around secrecy and protecting your identity, and these weren't places that were written about or talked about. And part of the reason this map exists, which was created in 1946, about places that were gone by 1930, is because they weren't documented then either, other than sort of police blotters and things of that nature. And it also documents the Great Migration. If you think about what's happening in so many of these clubs is jazz music and real creativity coming out of the African-American community, which is growing by leaps and bounds in the 19-teens and 20s. I mean, the Great Migration really kicks off in earnest in about 1915, 1916. So this is like the first decade of that influence being in Chicago, and it's monumental. So as we shrink away from talking about the gangs, we also miss a lot of other great Chicago history that gets lost in that too. And so I wanted to share this image just as a sort of another nod to the graphic elements that are in the collection that tell us so much about our city. But this map was published in the Chicago Tribune, and it is one of the first times that Chicagoans really got any exposure to the idea of Capone specifically, why Capone was such an element. I mean, people might have known who he was at the time when this was published, but they didn't necessarily see the extent of his empire, and you can see his name really all over this map. He has an incredible reach up to the north side, all the way to the very top of the map, all the way to the very south of the map. He's not a small figure in this map. Another thing that's important to remember, and I think that this is part of our problem with Capone, is that Capone was a different kind of gangster. This man is John Torrio. He's one of the early Chicago gangsters in the Prohibition era, and he's the man responsible for bringing Capone to Chicago in the first place. And Torrio was the kind of gangster that maybe was more familiar to us, 20 or 30 years ago. The sort of, don't tell anybody anything about what you're doing and keep a low profile, and violence is bad for all the operations. And he tried to solve disputes between the gangs without gunfire. And Capone did not see things the same way. He felt like weaponry was his friend, and he was ready to exploit it. So who is this guy? And I think that that's really what inspired us to do this app. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre app was to give us a chance to really look at this crime that could only have been perpetrated by somebody of Capone's stature, and look at it just in the cold light of day, because what's happening now is a sort of romanticism with this man, and he's not a good man. He was a bad dude, and if you hear that, you see that frequently. You see it not just in the way he's portrayed, or people of his like are portrayed in movies and Hollywood, or in TV, but also just in some corners of scholarship. I mean, there's this notion. So Al Capone ran a soup kitchen in the early days of the Depression, after the crash in 1929. So there's been this sort of undercurrent that he was somehow a man of the people, that he had a light touch when it came to the folks who drank his beer and were also the victims of many of his intimidations. There's this notion of Capone the businessman, the guy who saw the entrepreneurial opportunities of Prohibition and took advantage of them, and he was whip smart, and he was really to be admired in some way. Then there's Capone, the regular guy. Here he is at the baseball game. These are orchestrated events. He was documented in these scenes many times, so that he had that public persona of not being threatening, of being a guy who was just normal and everyday. And here, of course, Capone, the family man. Now, this we've seen this, and the characters of Vito Corleone and Tony Soprano. I mean, they had nothing on Al Capone. I mean, Al Capone inscribed this idea of the family-loving gangster. He was the first one to inscribe that on the American imagination. So, how were they thought of at the time? I mean, look at this. So you've got gangsters, you've got violence, but you've also got comfort with certain elements in this thing. So, 1932, Scarface comes out, and I want to play a bit of that right now, just so you get a sense of how this was being portrayed in 1932. Now remember, Capone has only been in prison less than a year when this film comes out. So if I can do this.
Scarface. In the 1920s, the United States was reeling under the impact of Prohibition. The sale of whiskey, wine, and beer was prohibited by law, but there were many willing to break that law. Gangsters took over. Crime flourished. Mobs fought each other for prime territories.
There's no use arguing with this joint. Ziegler runs it himself. Step on it.
And blood flowed in the streets. From Hitman.
That was a fine job, Tony. Remember, that's only chicken feed. You stepped into big company.
To gang boss. This is the story of Scarface Tony Carmonte, his lust for power, for fancy women.
Don't work too hard.
I just finish up tonight. Now I play a while.
His drive to be number one.
Next time I catch you in a place like that again, I'll kill you.
You're telling me what to do? What I do with Dallas is my business.
Starring Paul Muni as Scarface, and Vorak, George Raft, and Karen Morley. The crime scenes in this film are based on events that actually happened.
Don't you know it's Valentine's Day? Come on, they killed Ronaldo. Put up a fight when they tried to take him and hold up on that steel board of his. Get him.
What's the difference? Your fault, my fault. Just so you're here, that's all what matters.
I'm not afraid. I'm like you, Tommy.
That's the way to talk. You're not afraid, huh? Come on, we'll go.
Produced by Howard Hughes. Directed by Howard Hawks. Scarface.
Hey, look at that monkey there. They think they're going to get Tony. Come on, yeah?
Amazing.
What's your name?
Ray Donovan.
What do you do exactly?
I've got some, hang on a second. Just see what's going on there. All right. So, I got one more slide, and then I want to show you the app itself. More treatment of the gangs here. This is, I think, a really interesting poster that was made many years later called Sing a Song of Gangsters. We get a lot of requests for this at the museum, and in part because it reflects this ongoing fascination with these men, these gangsters, that what drove them, what inspired them, and what they were willing to do. And I think the answer to most of those questions is that what drove them was money, what inspired them was power and money, and what they were willing to do was just anything that they needed to get what they wanted. So there's this, I'm personally not offended by them, but I am feeling like part of our responsibility at the History Museum is to make sure that we don't leave a vacuum for others to fill with a narrative that isn't historically accurate and lets these criminals become folk heroes rather than the creeps that they actually were. So I'm going to go ahead here to the app. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play this app for you. And because we aren't all in virtual reality mode and you're not all able to sort of call this up yourselves right now, I'm going to play it here. So I will be you, essentially. So imagine as I'm moving through this experience, it's as if you have a viewer on and are moving your head around to look at the different elements of this landscape. It'll be, believe me, it'll be a little clearer once we're looking at it. But this is not the way it's meant to be seen. So, but it's the only way to do it in this sort of auditorium setting. But I do want to direct your attention to the website at the bottom of the screen. Everything that I've been talking about today in terms of digital output is free and of downloadable at the chicago00.org website. So just go there, download the media, and experience it for yourself. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you this app quickly. And what you'll see here is I'm manipulating this right now. Imagine
you wouldn't know it, but
you're
that's
doing
the
it.
site of the city's most infamous gangland killing, the St. Valentines Day Massacre. There, across the street, that vacant lot with the tree. The building where it happened was torn down a half-century ago. But on February 14th, 1929, the attention of the entire nation was on this block of North Clark Street in Chicago. The photographs of the scene shocked the country and turned the tide of public opinion against Chicago's violent bootlegging gangsters. That morning, a crowd gathered outside the SMC Cartage Company a garage that was known to be a front for George Bugs Moran's Northside gang. Gunshots had been heard from inside. If you look behind you, across the street to the east, from a window of that apartment building, a witness saw 4 men exit the garage and leave in a waiting car. 2 of them wore police uniforms. This is where the bodies were found. From about this spot, the killers opened fire. And this is where news photographers stood to capture the gruesome scene. When police arrived that morning, they found 7 men lying along the north wall of the garage, shot in the back. Members of Bugs Moran's Northside gang, Chicago racketeers and bootleggers in competition with Al Capone's Southside operation. It's guessed that the killers posed as police to make the victims think they were under arrest. Moran's men lined up against the wall, and then the killers opened fire. The floor was littered with shotgun and machine gun shell casings. 6 of the men were dead. The 7th, Frank Gusenberg, was taken to the hospital, but said little before he died a few hours later. It was these photos that outraged the public. Most people had never seen such gruesome front-page photos and such a cold-blooded killing. 7 men shot in the back on a Thursday morning in a quiet residential neighborhood. The photos were printed in newspapers across the country. Most ran with the story that the massacre had to be the culmination of the feud between Al Capone's outfit and Bugs Moran's Northside mob, 2 gangs that had been warring for control of Chicago's lucrative bootleg and racketeering business for years. The garage backed onto this alley. This is where the coroner's office removed the bodies from the scene. The coroner is there, facing you and the camera, Dr. Herman Bendison. He led the inquest. Autopsies were performed that same day. These are the bullets the medical examiners removed from the men found in the garage. They documented approximately 70 bullet wounds. The 7 victims were Albert Koshelik, alias James Clark, a Northside gang enforcer for Moran; Frank and Peter Gusenberg, brothers raised in the Lakeview neighborhood of Chicago, both notorious gunmen for Moran; John May, an auto mechanic who maintained the trucks at the garage; Reinhard Schwimmer, an optometrist without criminal record but a known hanger-on in the Northside gang scene; Adam Hayer, a business manager for Moran; and Albert Weinshank, a member of Moran's gang. The autopsies confirmed that the victims were shot in the back with multiple rounds from Thompson machine guns. These are the autopsy reports on Schwimmer and Koshelik. Multiple bullet wounds ranging from legs to arms to abdomen were found in Koshelik. In Schwimmer, 9 bullet wounds and 2 shotgun blasts, all from behind. The next day, police detectives and coroner staff staged a reenactment of the killings. In these photos, you can see the first attempts to imagine the massacre that has since been retold dozens of times in television shows, films, and books. No one was ever convicted of the massacre, but public opinion became increasingly hostile to the Chicago bootleggers, and federal agencies redoubled their efforts to put gangsters in prison. The building was demolished in 1967. Since then, this site has been a vacant lot. Although tourists often visit here, there are no historical markers for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The archive of photos and documents from that day now connect us to the event. This project is an attempt to tie those materials to 2122 North Clark Street in a new way.
Okay, so thank you very much for your time. I'd be happy to answer any questions you've got now.
Thank you, John. So we're going to go ahead and bring the lights up on all of you. Go ahead and raise your hand. We have a mic circulating on either side. If anyone up top wants to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll come up to you. All right, we're going to start right in the back.
Given the success of this app, aren't you more or less encouraging people not to go to the museum?
You know, I don't think there's a limitation on people's interest in the past. I mean, you know, it really is the stuff of our lives, right? And I think that what we see is sort of an endless community for people to be engaged with history, both their own personal experiences and city history. And I think that the more avenues we have for communicating with more people, the better for all of us. If somebody goes to this app and has that free experience and that drives them into deeper interest in the gangs or deeper interest in, you know, Chicago crime history or just interest in Chicago in general, that works to our advantage as well. I mean, obviously we're a nonprofit, but we still need patrons and we need donors, and so we're constantly looking to find that balance. But we also need to demonstrate our value to the people of this city. I think that that's, for any collecting organization, your ultimate worry is that as you build this beautiful, you know, amazing, remarkable collection for the good of the citizens of the city, if they don't engage with it, if they don't know about it, if they're not seeing it as a value to them, then maybe your fundamental effort to collect is non-purposeful. Yes?
And we've got a question right over here in the back.
Hi. So I guess it was last summer I was in Las Vegas, and I went to their crime museum. And
the mob museum?
Yeah, I was jealous that they have a crime museum and we don't. And of course we had a little bit of a part of it, but it was mostly, you know, kind of their way of seeing it. And they had Estes Favre's courtroom, right, which I remember my parents talking about, and then a little section on MS-13, which I thought, you know, again, Chicago is more of a pivot point for a lot of those things.
Right, so the Mob Museum, as it's called, is actually, it's got a very long title. I think it's the International Crime, no, it's the Organized Crime and Law Enforcement, I believe is its actual sort of certified title. Interestingly, I've been there. We've talked to them many times. They actually, so 2019, February, is the 90th anniversary of this event, and they want to feature this app at their museum. So they don't have anything like this, and they're not a collecting organization, so they have no collections to reveal. If you've been there, if you've been to this kind of museum before, all of the materials you're encountering are generally either borrowed materials or they're purchased materials for the display, but they don't have a research collection that they can tap into. So they don't have any way of doing this other than to come to an organization like the Chicago History Museum to get those materials.
All right, we've got a question down here.
As a business strategy, was this effort successful in changing the gang's territories? Did it work?
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre?
Did it work? Did somebody's territory get bigger and somebody's territory get smaller?
Good.
I mean, to what purpose?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question. So one of the arguments that's frequently made about the violence, I mean, this goes a little bit back to the John Torrio slide. If you remember, I said that Capone's mentor was a man who believed that violence was bad for the gangs. Too much violence was going to lead to police interference, federal law enforcement, things of that nature. And St. Valentine's Day Massacre is the event that proves the rule. Coming out of 1929, you have an incredible increase of interest in doing something about what is seen as unbridled gang activity in Chicago. It's a national story. The federal government seems impotent to do anything about it. The prohibition laws have been on the books for almost 20 years, or almost 10 years at this point, and here is clearly a bootlegging operation, a bootlegging issue, and no one is even charged with a crime related to prohibition. And in fact, of course, as many of you know, Al Capone wasn't actually incarcerated for either murder or conspiracy to murder for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre or prohibition violations. He was put in jail for tax evasion. But to the question, did this change the dynamic in Chicago? It definitely gave greater solidity to Capone's position in the city, even though he denied having anything to do with it, of course. People who were responding to this, the Northside gang, did feel like they had been attacked and somewhat retreated, although Bugs Moran, who has been the intended target of this, or this, what we assume was the intended target of this attack, did survive and did continue to run his gang operations for a few remaining years. But Prohibition, of course, is repealed in 1932 with the election of Franklin Roosevelt. So you begin to see this whole operation, even in the short term. If there had been short-term games, there certainly weren't long-term games.
Are you concerned with something like this when there may be conflicting views as to what occurred or as to who was at fault? The Eastland was an example of that. No one was ever brought to justice, and there are some questions regarding overloading the boat, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Are you concerned when you present this that this becomes the definitive answer? And
No.
maybe conflicts?
No, I think that, you know, part of the reason that digital is so attractive is that it's so malleable. We have the opportunities to correct anything that's inaccurate in these. If they become out of date, if somebody presents evidence that forces us to reconsider our position in the storytelling, we would just be able to do that. One of the great challenges in a museum when you put up an exhibition is that it's quite an extraordinary amount of work to undo something if you got it wrong. Part of the reason they take so long for us to get the exhibits open and out to the public is because we're very conscious of the fact that it's hard to go back and fix something if you get it wrong. So we take a lot of care. It isn't to say we don't take a lot of care with our digital projects, but if we get something wrong, it's relatively easy to pull it off, rewrite it, re-record it, do whatever needs to get done to get it correct. What we also are hoping to do, though, is engage people with history. The idea that we have created a scenario here, personally, I don't think that there's anything in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre app, for example, that's questionable. We don't say who's responsible for it. We don't draw any conclusions about why it was done, or even the question that you asked, was it a successful gangland initiative? So our goal was just to get over this hurdle. Part of the reason I said so much about the city's reluctance to talk about Capone is because I think it doesn't do us any good to have these conversations not be matter of fact, especially ones like this. We know what happened on February 14th, 1929, and we should just share it and be comfortable with that. And those conversations should be inspired from that. The same with the Eastland disaster. I think in that app, we recognize that no one's No one goes to prison for that. There's the threat of fines, there's insurance claims, there's all sorts of activity, but in the end, 844 people lose their lives and nobody is really held accountable for it.
We've got a question right down here.
Excuse me.
Right here, and then we'll head over there afterwards.
I'm not sure I understand the experience very well. By superimposing the historical photograph over the contemporary one, is that done today to illustrate this, or if the goal is full immersion, are you always mindful of the contemporary setting?
So in the programs that we've created so far, we don't have anything that's blanket media from the past. We have not yet encountered the challenge of having 360-degree media of an event from the past. So we are always needing to use the platform on which these stories happen be the present. Because we only have certain images from the past. So the platform, the background, is the present, or is near to our time. In the future, we might, since people are taking 360-degree videos all over the country right now, people who are trying to do what I'm trying to do now in the future won't find this challenging. You'll literally be able to look back at a 360-degree video of all sorts of historical events. The next president, maybe Trump's victory speech. Maybe somebody recorded that in 360-degree video. It's a relatively new technology. But for us, looking back at past events, all we have are sort of like snapshots, right, to lay into the landscape. So if you think about something like the Century of Progress World's Fair, as incredibly well documented as that event was, there are still lots of views we don't have. So we can't actually knit together a complete view of the entire fair.
So you always see contemporary shots juxtaposed
Yes.
with the historical.
Yes, and the point is in part to ground you, so that you know when you're a Chicagoan, let's say, and you know that area, you can see either the location of, say, Soldier Field, either in the past or in the present. Obviously, it hasn't moved, but in one shot it might be depicted in the past because, as you saw in that one shot, it's seen from above. But maybe in a later part of the episode, you might be at ground level and looking at it, and we might not have that shot. So what's in the image, in the composite image, is the contemporary building.
But don't you run the risk of, say, having young people think they're seeing something historical when they're picking up on contemporary images?
So that's what I was trying to get at before with the image of the automobile. When we started to experiment with this, we wanted to make that clear. We didn't want anybody confused about what they were looking at. We didn't want anybody to look at an image and think, oh, that lady in the drinking fountain with the Model T or whatever that car was, that's like from last week, and we made it look old by making it black and white or grainy. So we've been working with the outlines of the images, the way they're sort of feathered into the contemporary shot, to use the black and white versus color relationship, all to try and make it clear what's literally from the past as opposed to what was in the past but is different now, right? Is still with us today. And that's really the association we're hoping people can make. Now with most of these apps, you can also, once you have it downloaded onto your phone, you can use the screen to touch on any of the historical images. They will come up full screen. They'll pause the media, and you can look at that image and read a caption about what that content is more specifically if you're interested. So that would be another way in which you would know the past, what are the historical images and what are the contemporary shots we took to make this thing work.
We have time for just one last question, and we're going to go over here.
How many more of these do you have for us to see at the History Museum?
So we don't have any of them at the History Museum. They are all for you to have wherever you want to download them. You just go to chicago00.org, and they're all free, and they're all right there.
How many of them are there?
There are 4 altogether. There's the Eastland Disaster, Century of Progress, World's Fair, St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and the Democratic National Convention. Our hope then, as I said at the beginning, is to create enough of them, maybe a couple dozen, so that you would have a more complete story of Chicago through this medium, one that was controlled by you, that could be watched in your time when you were ready for it, that were interactive and mobile, and actually had the same impact on the viewer, whether they're here in Chicago or whether they're on the other side of the planet. A virtual reality experience, the big advantage of virtual reality is that it is the same experience for somebody sitting right here in this theater doing the St. Valentine's Day Massacre as if you were standing at the site of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, or if you were in Tokyo. They're all the same. The augmented reality experience is, like I said, one of the limitations there is that you sort of have to be in Chicago and standing by the riverside where that happened in order to have the full experience. So, we have 4 that are in development, and we have about 15 that are just ideas that are being researched at different times. So you need a couple of things to do this. You need a story, as we found out with the first experiments. You need a lot of images, and you really don't need a whole lot more than that. You need visual material, and you need a good story to tell. With augmented reality, you need public access to the site. I'll just say that was one of our first moves when we went from augmented reality to virtual reality. We wanted to do the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. That's private property. We knew we didn't want to be in the position of encouraging people to trample on somebody's private property. So we did it as a virtual experience because you can't go there and do that. But we've thought about lots of other ones. The one that we're working on right now, probably most actively, is on the World's Columbian Exposition. We have a lot of images in the collection that were taken of and from the Ferris wheel. So our hope is to actually be able to take you on a virtual ride on the Ferris wheel, so that you could see the Midway, you could see the White City, but you could also see Chicago. You have to remember that the Ferris wheel was the tallest thing in Chicago when it was built. So the view from the top of the Ferris wheel of the city is pretty extraordinary. So right now we're still we have a lot of those images in our collection, but we know that there's a lot of that media that's out there in other people's hands. So we're trying to bring that together to see if we can actually make that a coherent virtual experience. That's also part of it, is just, can you visually sort of explain what you're looking at so that it isn't confusing and disorienting?
We are actually out of time. I apologize. Thank you, everyone, for coming.